The following is a production of Notch 6 Media.
It's the Notch 6 online podcast, episode number 46. In this episode, we venture outside of the world of O-gauge trains just slightly to take an amazing look at Walt Disney's railroad story as told through the eyes of a man who was actually there with Walt Disney as he built his backyard railroad. Historian and author Michael Broggie will join us for a fascinating interview telling us about his own adventure with Walt Disney and trains and exploring the legacy of Disney railroading down through the generations. It's an amazing episode of Notch 6 that you're going to love.
This is the Notch 6 online podcast. Notch 6 is the podcast dedicated to O-gauge trains. Whether you're collecting, operating, or just getting started, Notch 6 is your home for O-gauge news, events, and interviews. Now here is your host, Derek Thomas.
Well, welcome to another episode of Notch 6, the only podcast dedicated to O-gauge trains. My name is Derek Thomas, and whether you are an O-gauge railroad fan, whether you found this podcast by Googling the words Walt Disney or Roger or Michael Broggie, or if you just happen to like listening to really cool podcasts, well, you're in the right spot. Normally, we talk about trains and nothing but trains, but you're going to get a little bit more than trains today. You're going to get a great history lesson on Walt Disney and his love of trains. And not only is this a history lesson on Walt Disney and his love of trains, but you're going to hear about some interesting interactions Walt had with Lionel, some of Walt's early model railroads, and so much more. So we're excited to have you on board for this episode. I'm not going to take too much time for the monologue today just because, the longer we do this show, the more I find that, these interviews are getting longer and longer, and I'm having less and less time to talk to you guys about what's going on in our world. So we'll keep the monologue rather short. A couple things I want to mention, though, before we get into the Michael Broggie interview. One of those is if you are a West Coast listener, specifically Colorado area, I want to tell you about an event that's coming up November 29th and November 30th in Denver, and that's the Rocky Mountain Toy Train Show. This is a great event, especially for our West Coast listeners, that York may be too much of a stretch to make it out. So if Denver is in your general neck of the woods, I encourage you guys to check this out. The website is RockyMountainTrainShow.com. Again, RockyMountainTrainShow.com. They're going to have over 600 tables of trains of all gauges and scales, a number of operating layouts, and this is really a nice show from everything I've been told. So check them out at RockyMountainTrainShow.com. November 29th and November 30th in Denver, Colorado. A great show for our West Coast listeners. And if that's a little too close for you to plan in this time and you want to plan some travel to Denver and hit a good train show at the same time, the show will be back March 7th and 8th, 2015. So a little bit more time to plan for the spring edition of the Rocky Mountain Toy Train Show. So that's a great event for our West Coast listeners. Things that are going on around here. We'll tell you about a few now, and we'll tell you about a few at the end of the show. Man, I can't believe the holidays are rolling up on us so fast. It seems like I was just, getting through the beginning of the summer, and here it is, November. Where has, 2014 gone? It's almost in the books. And so as we look to 2015 as a podcast, I want to get more feedback from you, the listener, this time as we head into a new year. And we've got some stuff lined up for early next year already that I think you guys are going to really enjoy listening to. But as we get farther into 2015, I want feedback from you guys about what you want to hear in the show. I'm a one-man show, and so normally the topics and the questions come straight from my brain, and I feel like I've got a pretty good idea of what you guys want to hear, but not all the time. So one of the things that I'm working on before the end of the year is we're going to send out a listener survey that if you kind of want to help create the sound of the show for 2015, would love to have you participate in that survey and just give me some feedback about who you want to hear, what you want to hear, what topics you like, what you don't, what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, and everything else in between. So that's something that's going to happen before the end of the year. Now, things that are going to happen before the end of the year show-wise, I have two shows in mind. One of them was planned and one of them was unplanned up until about a week ago. The unplanned show is going to be a little bit of a, how shall we say this, holiday guide / product announcement piece. And so what the plan is at this point is Ken Bianco Jr. from Train World, which is one of the larger dealers on the East Coast and a very reputable dealer of Lionel, MTH, and Williams. He's going to join me here on Thanksgiving evening for the Notch 6 Holiday Guide. I've asked Ken to put together a list of products that he thinks is cool for the holidays. You'll hear about some specials from them for the holidays. And so we're just going to chat a little bit about some of the upcoming products that if you're thinking about gifts to give or thinking about gifts to ask for, you'll want to listen to that show. Also during that show, I'm going to make a special product announcement from the Madison Poster Company. We've had a great year here, and I want to do something really special for the holidays. So instead of making a sale and giving you less, I found a way to give you more. And I'm going to give you more by including something from a very, very well-known person. And we're going to leave it at that. So, if you want to know what the big blockbuster announcement is, and I don't know if it's blockbuster, but I think it's a really special holiday promotion that you guys are really going to enjoy. Come back here on Thanksgiving evening, whether you're traveling, whether you've just got some time to sit and let the turkey digest. We'll have a show for you Thanksgiving evening into Black Friday. Not exactly sure on the release time of that show yet, but my guess is Thanksgiving afternoon, Thanksgiving evening for a short, abbreviated, but fun episode of Notch 6. It'll be the Notch 6 Holiday Guide. Also, another show that is just around the corner that is one of my favorite shows to produce every year is the Notch 6 Christmas Spectacular. If you haven't listened to the show from last year, it's worth going back and listening to. I have a lot of fun with the show. A lot of unexpected things have come out of this show from the first edition. We're going to try to keep up with the second edition and make it just as fun as last year's. And I've got a great story lined up for you that'll really just get you in the mood for the holidays. If you aren't already by that point, that episode will be out in early December. So that's what's going on here at Notch 6, other than me scrambling to get my layout ready for holiday guests. Other than that, it's just nice to feel a little chill in the air. It's nice to spend some more time in the basement carving up mountains. By the way, if you want to see my attempts at mountain carving, hop on over to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/notch6. That's NOTCH and the number 6, all is one word. Facebook.com/notch6. Be sure to check that out. Okay, we'll leave it at that for my part of the show. I'll be back at the end of the show for just a moment just to fill you in on a couple things and give you a couple quick reminders. But now let's get into the interview for this show. My guest this month is Michael Broggie, who is the son of Disney's first Imagineer, Roger Broggie. If you need to know more about Roger, look him up on Google, and you will be astounded at the projects he was involved in. But you'll hear a little bit about that from Michael himself as well. Anyway, Michael is kind of the keeper of the Disney railroad legend, so to speak. I think a lot of model railroaders know that Walt Disney enjoyed model trains, enjoyed real railroading just as much. And he, along with a couple of his friends in the Disney company, notably Ward Kimball and a few other folks, really spent a lot of their free time outside of the Disney company building full-size, well, I shouldn't say full-size, building miniature steam railroads in their backyard. And the notable one was in Walt's backyard, and that is the Carrollwood Pacific. Well, Michael grew up around the Carrollwood Pacific, so you're going to hear his story of what it was like to grow up riding Walt Disney's backyard railroad. This is a great interview. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. And so I ask you to sit back, put it in Notch 6. Here comes Michael Broggie on the Notch 6 podcast.
This is Notch 6, your first source for breaking news and in-depth interviews in the world of O-Gauge.
Welcome back to the Notch 6 online podcast. A very special guest with me today, something that's a little out of the norm for us. We're going to go outside of the world of O-Gauge railroading today, but a very interesting railroad story nonetheless. I'd like to welcome to the show Michael Broggie, who's the author of Walt Disney's Railroad Story and really the historian on Disney and railroads. Michael, welcome to the show. So happy to have you here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's get started with the question that I ask all my guests. Before we start talking about Disney and his love of trains, Tell me about growing up in California and how you got involved with model railroading. What did growing up look like for you?
When I was about 7 years old, uh, my father, who was Disney's first Imagineer, his name was Roger Broggie, he came home one day. We were living out in the San Fernando Valley. He came home with boxes of HO gauge railroad equipment. And he explained that this was part of a layout that Walt had designed, built, and had at his home. And my brother and I, being, just kids, to us it was just an elaborate toy layout. It was partially constructed. It wasn't finished, but there were buildings and little mountains carved out of styrofoam. There were brass model engines and trackage and rolling stock and so on. Well, Walt had the wood shop at the studio build a beautiful hard maple table with a 4-inch border around it with curved corners. It was a 4x8 layout, and it ended up in our bedroom, which we shared, and we would play with it, push the trains around the track and so on. Never really got into developing it out, but that was my first up-close introduction to model trains. And later I found out that Walt had a desire to provide model trains for some of the relatives in the family. Boys growing up always have to have a model train. So he had a history, a relationship with the people at Lionel. In fact, those that know their Disney history know that the Disney company had licensed Lionel to produce a Mickey and Minnie handcar during the depths of the Depression. Lionel was in really bad shape. In fact, they were in bankruptcy. And via the license, they were able to produce this wind-up handcar and a loop of track, and the whole thing in a box sold for $1. And over the course of marketing that Lionel handcar, which are now prized possessions for collectors, the company sold over 250,000 of them and was able to dismiss the bankruptcy and continued on to this day. So there was a very close relationship, and the people at Lionel never forgot what Walt had done for them. And so in the 1940s, when Walt wanted some train equipment to assemble some layouts for the kids in the family, he made a phone call and said, if you've got some extra equipment or something you could send over, I'd like to have them for the boys in the family. Then one day, not long after that, Walt got a call from his receiving dock at the studio in Burbank, and the fellow said, "Walt, you better come down here." So he went over to the warehouse there, and here were a couple of huge boxes with the Lionel trademark on the side. And so he opened up the boxes like a kid at Christmas and started pulling out engines, rolling stock, buildings, trackage, all the ingredients for his train layouts. And the fellow that told me that story, who was working at the studio at the time, he said, Walt actually got emotional, that he felt what a terrific gift from Lionel, and then in turn for the children and the family to be able to get these train sets. And then Walt proceeded to take some of that equipment and installed a 4x8 Lionel layout in his office at the studio. He had a complex of rooms. It consisted of about 5 rooms in a suite on the 3rd level of the animation building. And that layout was the first evidence that his colleagues at the studio learned that Walt was in fact a train enthusiast.
Very interesting. And from there, the story only starts to expand outward with Ward Kimball getting involved, your father getting involved, and suddenly, this story takes on a life of its own with Disney's love of trains, and it really starts to weave its way into the Disney legacy. But Disney's love of trains didn't just start, later in life. Can you kind of explain how Disney became interested in toy trains and where this passion for railroading started?
Well, first of all, I don't think he ever saw them as toys. I mean, to him they were scale models. And I do a presentation called Walt Disney's Railroad Story, and I like to tease my audience by saying that as we get older, our toys just get more expensive. And instead of calling like a train set a toy, we call them scale models. And instead of playing with your toys, we call it a hobby. But in truth, we're just kids with more expensive toys as we gain in age. But Walt's history of involvement in railroading goes back to his days in Marceline, Missouri, where he was a farm boy. His family had moved from Chicago to Marceline, a small farming community, moved there in 1906 when Walt was 4. And at that time, when the family bought a 40-acre farm right outside the city limits, the population was 2,500. Every year, the town holds a celebration of Walt and animation and cartooning festival every September, and the population is still 2,500. They never built a big box discount store. There are no golden arches. It's very much a preserved little Midwestern farm town, and Walt celebrated that small town America via Main Street USA at Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World, and of course in Anaheim. So Walt always admired the role of small town America, and as a farm boy, part of growing up there was the fact that right through the center of town, every 20 minutes or so, was a Santa Fe freighter passenger train running through the town, one way or the other, out of Kansas City, through Marceline, on up to Fort Madison, Iowa. And that diagonal line was the Santa Fe Railroad. And Walt's uncle, actually he was a cousin, but he's referred to as Uncle Mike, he was an operating engineer on the Santa Fe. And Marceline, because it was about halfway between Kansas City and Fort Madison, was a water and coal refueling stop. They were mining coal, they had abundant water, so it made an ideal location for the Santa Fe refueling. And as they would stop, the crew would stay in town at the local hotel, and cousin Mike would stay at the family's farmhouse. And this gave an opportunity for Walt and his older brother Roy to hear these wonderful tales of the high iron and the lore and legacy of railroading, and stories about Casey Jones and Buffalo Bill Cody, who used to hunt buffalo to feed the railroad crews as they built railroads across America. I mean, there was great stories. And later on, Walt wove these stories into movies, cartoons, and so on. We saw evidence of this early education he was getting as a child on the front porch of the family farmhouse. And further research showed that Walt's father, Elias Disney, who had immigrated to the United States out of Canada, ended up in Kansas City, went to work for the Union Pacific, they were laying track from Kansas City across the Great Plains up to Denver. And for 3 years, he worked as a carpenter on the Union Pacific. So he had that background as well, and this is prior to him marrying Walt's mom, Flora Call. So there was a great thread that ran through the Disney family of railroading. Not uncommon for the era, but unfortunately our children today are not educated in the history of railroading and how it literally made this country.
Very interesting. So Disney had railroading in his blood from an early age, and obviously he goes on to start his animation career. And as he establishes this animation career, this hobby begins to blossom for him. And like I said, that's kind of where you come into the story as the recipient of Walt's HO layout. Tell me what it was like to be around Walt growing up. And like I said, obviously, you know, this hobby was blossoming for him. Can you kind of recount some of the stories of what you saw growing up as he made his transition from HO to live steam and some of the stories that you witnessed growing up?
Well, I can remember my father telling me what it was like he running the machine shop at the studio. My father was a precision machinist. I was hired at the studio in the late 30s to build camera equipment, maintain the equipment used for making animated films and then later live action motion pictures. So these were skilled technicians that could lay out a pattern, could machine to within 13 thousandths tolerance. I mean, these guys were really as good as it got as far as operating a drill press and a lathe and so on. So this collection of talented individuals that my father was in charge of could build about anything. Well, one day Walt walks in. This is in early 1949. Walks into the shop, which at that time was located up near the main gate of the studio off of Buena Vista Street in Burbank. And the shop was right there. As Walt would go to his office, he would pass right by the machine shop. Well, he used to like to drop in because he always admired technicians who had ability to build things with their hands. And being that Walt's father was a carpenter and Walt had learned carpentry from his dad, but he always admired the machine work. So he asked my dad one morning on one of these visits, he said, "Roger, Lillian and I just bought enough land, it happened to be in West Los Angeles in Holmby Hills." He said, "We got enough land, enough property where I can have an outdoor railroad." Now, prior to this, Walt had visited Ollie Johnston's backyard, where Ollie had a beautiful 1/12 scale railroad running around his home in the La Cañada Flint Ridge area of Los Angeles. And of course, he was at Ward's home in 1945. Ward and his family hosted what they called a steam-up party. And Ward and Betty had purchased a steam locomotive from the Central Nevada Railroad. It was an 1881 Mogul steam engine. It was going to be scrapped. And Ward and Betty paid $400 for this steam locomotive, had it flatbedded on a truck and hauled to their property in San Gabriel, California, where they had about maybe a half an acre of land. Not enough to run a loop of narrow gauge, but enough to lay about 100 yards of track. And they proceeded to totally restore this engine. And in 1945, Walt was invited by Ward to be the honorary engineer to roll out what he called the Emma Nevada out of its barn on the property. And there are pictures of Walt and Ward inside the Emma Nevada, and Walt's got this fantastic smile on his face. He's rediscovering what it was like to be in the cab of the steam locomotive. And so he was the honorary engineer, and he reconnected back to a childhood memory. When he was 14, he was hired by the Missouri Pacific Railroad in the role of a news butcher. That's a kid who sells goods to passengers. While they're rambling along the countryside, the kid is going up and down passenger cars with a box tied around his neck, and he's got apples and soda pop and cigars and newspapers, so on. So that was Walt's first venture into business, with a $30 loan from his older brother to start his activities. His older brother had done the same job when he was younger, when Walt had gone to him and says, "Roy, I need to earn some money," because the family didn't have much. And so Roy suggested, "We'll go down and apply for this job as a news butcher." And Walt found out later that Thomas Edison had also served on railroads as a news butcher. So there was some nice connection to history there. And so that time, Walt wanted to be a railroad engineer like Mike Martin, his Uncle Mike. And that was his aspiration, be a railroad engineer. He used to take the apples from the family farm, and he would bribe the engineer to teach him all of the valves and levers inside the cab so that he could fulfill his desire to be an engineer. And so years later, as you stated, he got wrapped up in making cartoons and motion pictures. And I always maintain that he got derailed from his real ambition. And so in this picture of Walt and Ward, you can see how his face just lights up of being in that cab with his hand on the throttle. And then later, and when Disneyland got going, he decided that an absolutely essential ingredient of Disneyland was to have a steam railroad. In fact, he told his designers, Herbie Ryman, who was the original conceptual designer, Disneyland, said that Walt told him, "I want it to be unlike anything in the world and a steam train running around it." And I always maintain that Disneyland was the gift that Walt left for all of us, and the ribbon around the gift was the steam railroad. Well, anyway, the railroad was actually owned by Walt as his personal property. It was not owned by the Disney company, not by the joint venture Disneyland Incorporated. It was his personal railroad. He had a right-of-way agreement with Disneyland Incorporated to run his railroad around the park, and he had a personal company that were his initials, W-E-D, Walter Elias Disney, WED Enterprises, and that was the holding company that, among other things, owned the steam train around Disneyland. So when Walt was in the park, which he was often, he was a hands-on manager. He loved to be in every corner of the park and know everything that was going on. And occasionally, when he got all of the tasks done that he wanted to accomplish, he kept a full engineer's outfit in his apartment above the fire station. So he would go over to his apartment, slip into the hickory striped bib overalls and the engineer's cap and the red bandana, and then he would quickly step across the plaza to the Main Street station and go up to the engineer at the next train that pulled into the station. He'd go up to the fellow there in the cab and he said, "Son, you're on break." And it wasn't just a request. That was the boss saying, "You go sit down because I'm taking your spot." And Walt would then proceed to run the railroad around the park. And in those days, there were just two stations, one in Frontierland, one at Main Street. And so he would run the train around the park. And I always maintain if anyone was a visitor to Disneyland between 1955, when it opened in the summer of 55, and by the time Walt became somewhat incapacitated due to his health in late 1966, if you rode the train at Disneyland, it's possible that fellow with the bushy mustache up in the cab was Walt running your train. So you can fantasize over that, but he spent as much time as he could running his train around the park. Of course, that was preceded by the, as you alluded to, this backyard railroad in Holmby Hills.
Right, and for our listeners that want something unique to go look up, out on YouTube, there is black and white video that has been posted by a user of the opening day ceremonies at Disneyland. And it's just one of the first activities at Disneyland that day, and you'll also see a young Ronald Reagan hosting this program. But one of the first activities at Disneyland is Walt actually pulling up to, I believe it's the Main Street station, in the locomotive. And that's how Disneyland was opened, with Walt bringing the train into the station. And the look of joy on his face as he brings that train into Disneyland for the opening ceremonies is just, I think a lot of people who love and care about trains can relate to that kind of joy that he was experiencing. So if you want something neat to look at, that footage is out there on YouTube. And, it's very clear listening to you, Michael, how passionate he truly was about trains. Let's circle back to the Carolwood Pacific, which is what we had started alluding to. Tell me a little bit about the history of the Carolwood Pacific, and obviously this predated Disneyland, so there's a lot of history here in the Carolwood. Kind of tell me how it got started and paint me a picture of what this railroad looked like in his backyard.
Well, I'll digress back to when Walt walked into the machine shop that morning when he informed my dad that he had bought enough land to have a railroad. And he said to my dad, Roger, I want you and your team to build a miniature railroad for the new yard. And my dad had worked for Walt long enough by then where if the boss says, I want you to do something for me, you have one answer. Oh, sure, Walt, we can do that. And then Walt walked out of the shop, and then my dad turned around to the fellows working for him. He says, now what the hell am I going to do? I don't know the first thing about miniature railroads. Well, my dad was fortunate. He had a fellow working for him as a precision draftsman by the name of Eddie Sargent. And Eddie was a live steam modeler in half-inch live steam. And so he had that background, and he'd also worked as a draftsman for the Central Pacific. And so Eddie asked my dad, did Walt happen to mention what era or what model he wanted to put in his yard? And my dad looked at his notes. He said, yeah, he said something about what he called a CP-173. And Eddie says, oh, I know that engine. It was the first steam engine built in California in 1872. Up to that time, locomotives were put aboard ships and hauled around. This is before the canal. You had to go around South America to get to the West Coast. And then later with the Continental Railroad, you could haul equipment across country. Well, this all preceded that. 1872 was just the beginning of the West Coast railroad expansion. So Walt admired the diamond stack, the brass, the configuration of the 440 engine, and Central Pacific built a number of these engines, like the Enyo, and there are several of them that reside in museums, those that have survived. And so he said, that's the engine that I want. And a fellow by the name of Jerry Best, who was a sound engineer at Warner Brothers, also an expert in live steam miniatures, he had crafted a half-inch scale live steam CP-173, and it was installed in the Pan-Pacific Exposition. And Walt was visiting Jerry at his home in Beverly Hills, and he had the model on his mantle. And Walt looked at it, and he says, that's the most perfectly proportioned steam engine I've ever seen. And that's when Jerry, who has written 12 books on railroad history, explained its pedigree and what its importance was to the history of railroading. So Walt says, that's the engine. And then Eddie asked my dad, well, what scale? Did Walt mention the scale? And my dad says, yes. He said, everyone is modeling in 112, as was Dick Jackson, who also had a home in Beverly Hills and had, in 1930, installed a 112 scale live steam. And there are pictures of my brother and me riding on Dick Jackson's railroad, and Walt was there, and we as kids would go with Walt to these backyards. And so Walt was familiar with 112. He says, yeah, but you know what? I want mine larger. Let's make it 1/8 scale, 50% larger than anyone else. And as far as I know, that was probably the first 1/8 scale live steam that was built in this country, as far as I know. Because, you know, one of the things you do in railroad modeling is you try to standardize for the ease of getting parts and so on. Well, by going to 1/8, that meant everything had to be scratch built.
Oh, man.
So there was no kits, no nothing, even the trackage, everything scratch built. So Eddie and a fellow who worked as an architect at the studio went out to the property, 5 acres on Carrollwood Drive, hence the name of the backyard railroad, Carrollwood, and then by using the word Pacific, gave Walt the initials of the Central Pacific, CPRR. And so on all the freight equipment, everything, you had the initials CPRR, just like the Central Pacific. And somebody might ask, well, why in the world would that be important? But that's what model railroading is all about. It's accuracy and scale. So Walt had his initials, he had CPRR, called it the Carrollwood Pacific, and then he had a slogan called Fair Weather Route. And that was printed on a stripe across the logo for his miniature railroad. And he said that was a tribute to Southern California weather, the Fair Weather Route. And the kid that grew up in Illinois and Missouri, you know, winters were pretty rough. Well, he always loved the Southern California climate. So that was his way of, a tribute. So anyway, the backyard, Eddie did a layout, running the track around the property and looked at a topography of the land, and then gave it to Walt to look at. And Walt says to Eddie, "No, you have all the track in the backyard portion of the property. I want this to run all the way around the property, around the house." So Eddie redrew it, and now the trackage amounted to 2,515 feet of track. Half a mile of trackage on 5 acres. I mean, this is intertwined with 11 cutouts, and it required trestles and bridges and tunnels and so on to get all around the topography of the land. So Walt takes it home one evening to show Lillian the track layout. And he spreads it out on the kitchen table, and she's looking at it. And she said, "Wait a minute. This is called a backyard layout. But you got your track running all the way around the house, across the driveway, through where I want to plant my rose garden, and then through the flower garden." And she put up a real protest. No way. Now, Lillian was about 5 feet tall, but she could really stand up to Walt. And she said, "There is no way I'm going to do this." So Walt goes back to the studio the next day, and he calls over to his legal department. He says, "Get over here. I need some help." So the fellow shows up in Walt's office. He says, "What's up, Walt?" Knowing it was something really important. And he says, "I need you to write an agreement." So the guy took out his notebook, and he says, "Okay, Walt, what's the agreement?" He says, "Well, we call it a right-of-way agreement." And he said, "Okay, right-of-way agreement. And what's the location?" "Well, it's on my property over on Carrollwood Drive. And the other party is my wife, Lillian." And so the attorney looks at Walt and he says, "Wait a minute, Walt, this is California. It's called an equal property state. You have an undivided half interest in the property. No right-of-way agreement is necessary." And Walt looked at the fellow and he says, "You don't know my wife."
I think a lot of us still go through that today with our basements and wherever our model railroaders may end up.
Yes, we do. We're there by privilege only.
That's right.
So the final agreement was drafted, and in fact, just for those that might ever need reference for such an agreement, I printed the entire text of that agreement in a book called Walt Disney's Railroad Story. And so that's a good template for a right-of-way agreement. So he had Lillian sign it, and the girls, Diane and Sharon, his daughters, were the witnesses to their parents signing the agreement. But there was still a caveat, and that was Lillian saying, "You've got to figure out a way to run your track through my garden. I don't want to see it," because she had windows of that side of the house for her canasta room. She had built a little octagon room where her and her lady friends would get together and play canasta, overlooking a beautiful flower garden. Lillian always loved landscaping. She loved flowers and trees and so on. So she says, "You have to figure out a way to solve that." So Walt has one of his guys at the studio, head of construction, a fellow by the name of Jack Rorix. So Jack comes over to the house, and they're walking around that side where Lillian's garden was planned. And Walt says, "I got to figure this out. You got to help me." So Jack looks at him. He says, "Well, we could build a trestle. Or, no, that would be too high. It wouldn't work. How about a trellis? We'll grow vines on it." And Walt said, "That's not going to work because she wants to be able to see her whole garden." So finally, Jack comes up with a solution. Why don't we build a tunnel? So they paced off the distance from the curve of the track going through the garden out to another point where another trestle would pick up. And it turned out to be 90 feet. So they got some equipment over there, and they started tunneling down 11 feet underground. And then as they started the construction, Walt says, "You know what, Jack?" He says, "If this thing had just run straight through, that's kind of boring. Why don't we do this? Let's make it an S-curve, where you enter it in one end, and the S-curve will obliterate the light at the other end of the tunnel, be totally pitch black inside the tunnel until you finally get to the other end, and then you start to open up into the lighted end." And so Jack says, "Gee, Walt, that's going to make this a lot more expensive." And so Walt looked at him and says, "I'm not doing this to save money. Just figure out how you're going to build an S-curve, and let's do it." So they ended up doing 11 feet down, a curved ceiling, all reinforced concrete with rebar, 90 feet long. Some people referred to it as the longest bomb shelter ever built in Southern California. Because you can imagine how thick this had to be, because you're going to put plantings and dirt and everything over the top of it. It had to be all reinforced construction. So I can remember as a 8-year-old, 1950. I just gave away my age. 1950, my first time riding on that train. I'm straddling a boxcar. Now with Walt, everything had to be accurate to the era, and this era was 1872. And those that are familiar with railroad equipment of that period know that what freight cars had what they called arch bar suspension. Arch bar suspension later was outlawed by the PUC. It was dangerous. It was subject to derailment. And they improved suspension for railroad equipment and eliminated arch bar. Well, all of this equipment was built as arch bar equipment, meaning it was subject to derailment.
Oh, boy.
So I'm sitting on top of a boxcar, straddling this wooden boxcar. And you're kind of rocking back and forth a little bit because, it's all scaled to perfect dimensions of 1/8. And as you round the turn, go through Lillian's rose garden, and then you start to enter this arch into the tunnel. And I could remember you could You could hear the chuffing of the engine echoing off the walls of the tunnel. You could feel the vibration of the track under your seat. You could smell the coal smoke. Walt had coal mined in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It was an anthracite nut coal, and he had it ground to perfect 1/8 scale nuggets, and 100-pound sacks were shipped to his house from Pennsylvania, and everything in perfect scale. And so you could smell the coal smoke. You could taste the smoke, and then your vision is totally blacked out because it's absolutely pitch black. So in one instant, this experience touched every one of your senses: of sight, smell, sound, taste, touch, everything. And then as you proceed through the tunnel, eventually there's a small crescent of light that appears at the far end. And that crescent grows into full sunlight, and then you're out on a 46-foot long trestle, 11 feet to the ground, with another series of track below the trestle, and then you're rounding the curve, and you're looking down a 150-foot canyon. And you're on an elevated berm. No safety straps, no handlebars to hold on to, and arch bar suspension. Now, as a kid, 8 years old, I didn't know, I didn't understand the danger that I was in at that moment. Fortunately, the boxcars never derailed, not while I was riding on it. There were other derailments in the yard, but nothing of any serious consequences. But I think looking back on it, we realized that Walt had constructed his very first thrill ride in his backyard. I remember seeing kids from the neighborhood. Across the street was Frank Sinatra and his family. And the Sinatra kids used to come over and ride on the train. And a little skinny, little blonde-haired gal, her name was Candace Bergen. And I knew who her father was because he was the ventriloquist, Edgar Bergen, Charlie McCarthy, and all that. And Salvador Dali came out and rode on the train with Ward Kimball. I mean, you never knew who might show up at the backyard. And of course, being a kid, you don't know. You know, these are celebrities; these are well-known people, but they're just more people visiting. And I can remember as a kid standing out in front of the barn one Saturday because my brother and I and my dad were the crew for Walt. He needed a crew. You have a railroad, you got to have a crew. So we were tapped as his crew. So we'd go out there on a Saturday and Sunday, and my dad would help Walt prepare the engine for steam up. My brother and I would haul water and coal to fill the tender and so on. And then we'd go up to the tunnel where the rolling stock was kept. And you could do a gravity run out of the tunnel down into Yenstedt Valley, which is Disney spelled backward. You call that Yen. So you'd ride the gondolas, the cattle car and the freight car down into the valley, and then you do hook up lanes in what railroaders call a consist. And that was our job, to get everything wiped down and clean. And then at the appropriate time, when everything was done, Walt would go into his barn and carry out his yellow bobber caboose that he had built himself. The frame and the trucks were built in the machine shop, but the superstructure was all Walt's work because he knew woodworking. And the thing was all perfectly detailed inside, with a little pot-bellied stove and bunks and even magazines and calendars, everything in perfect scale. That yellow caboose is now on display at the Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. And the lid was hinged so you could lift it and look down inside of it. And the barn from the backyard, we preserved it after Mrs. Disney passed away in end of 1997. we got a call from Walt's daughter Diane. Said, Michael, we got to save Dad's barn because the house had been sold, and they were afraid it was just the building just be reduced to kindling. So we went over there with a construction engineer who was specialized in preservation work, and we took it all apart, numbered all the pieces, stored it, and then eventually did a deal with the city of Los Angeles to locate it at the Griffith Park area called Los Angeles Live Steamers. And to this day, that barn is open free to the public every third Sunday year-round. And we have filled with all kinds of Walt memorabilia and stuff from my dad, Ward Kimball, Ollie Johnston, and so on, and other stuff outside the barn. So if anybody in your audience is ever in Southern California on the third Sunday, they're invited to come and enjoy experiencing Walt's hobby at the barn.
Very neat. And there are other examples of Carolwood pieces that are still spread out through the Disney kingdom, so to speak. The Carolwood room that's at Disneyland, correct?
The Carolwood Pacific room is at the Wilderness Lodge Resort in Florida.
That's right. I get my Disney parks confused and where the trains are, but I believe they have an original gondola still on display. There are some, and I think one of the crossovers from the backyard as well.
The crossover actually it was at the barn in Griffith Park, and it is now being integrated into a part of an amazing exhibit that Michael Campbell, who's on our board of governors and president of the Carolwood Society, Mike Campbell is the guest curator of a show that will open in November at the Walt Disney Family Museum at the Presidio in San Francisco, and it will run into January or later. But it's going to be a whole exhibit hall filled with Walt-related railroad ephemera, memorabilia, and so on. So any of your listeners that are out in the Bay Area in San Francisco must put that on their bucket list to go see that exhibit that's being put.
It's an amazing exhibit. It was on display, and again, if I get my parks confused, you'll have to correct me. I believe it was on display at Disneyland about 2 years ago. Does that sound right? Same exhibit?
Not to this extent. No, this exhibit has never been assembled before in the scope that this one is, and it includes personal items from my collection, from that of John Lasseter, who is carrying on Walt's legacy of railroad. He's on our board of governors, and John always tries to weave a steam train into his pictures if he can do it. If anyone has seen the latest Pixar movie, Planes, Fire and Rescue, there's a wonderful steam locomotive in that film that is a knockoff of the Lily Bell, Walt's engine. He called it Lily Bell in honor of Lillian and their acquiescence of Walt's hobby. but it's, in the movie, this locomotive is called the Muir after John Muir, and but it's a spot-on replica of the 440 CP-173. And in cars, there's a train and so on. I mean, he always tries to work an engine in. In Toy Story 3, there's a wonderful steam railroad sequence in that film. So, and John has his own narrow gauge railroad at his home in Glen Ellen, California, and he's got some equipment from Ward. He's got Ward's train station from his backyard, and he's got the narrow gauge that Ollie Johnston owned, who was located down in North San Diego County. And so Ollie not only had the 112th in the backyard, he had a full-size vintage narrow gauge on his property in San Diego County. So fortunately, John had learned about that equipment passing to a subsequent owner, and he approached Ollie and says, "Do you mind if I inquire about buying that train?" And Ollie was delighted. He said, "Sure," because the guy doesn't know anything about trains. So John ended up buying that equipment, and then in 2005, when Disneyland was celebrating its 50th anniversary, our Carolwood Society staged an event at Disneyland pre-opening, and at the time, Disney Company was negotiating with Steve Jobs to acquire Pixar or to extend their agreement, because there was an agreement where Disney was releasing all the Pixar films. They had an exclusive agreement. Well, that had run out, and Disney wanted to renew it, and that was under, at the time, Michael Eisner was head of the company. Well, unfortunately, Michael Eisner and Steve Jobs didn't really care for each other. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the super egos. Both of these individuals.
No, nothing at all.
Nothing with that. But anyway, they couldn't come to a term agreement that Lasseter, sensing this was an opportunity, got a hold of Eisner and said, "I'd like to do a favor for my mentor, Ollie Johnston." And so Eisner, also a bright guy and sniffing out a potential opportunity, said, "Well, what do you got in mind?" He says, "Well, I've acquired a narrow gauge railroad that's the same gauge as Disneyland. It belonged to Ollie. It's been fully restored. I'd like to install it on the track at Disneyland, invite Ollie to come and run his train around Disneyland.
Wow.
What do you think?" So Eisner, hearing this request and realizing that Lasseter was the linchpin in Pixar, said, "Let me get back to you." He called his legal people and said, "Lasseter wants to bring his train and put it on the tracks at Disneyland. What do you think?" Well, immediately the flags go up. "Oh, no, you can't do that. It's dangerous. It's a pressurized vehicle. What if it explodes and everybody's killed?" On and on. All the what ifs. That's what lawyers are for. So what Eisner says, "I don't care how you figure out how to do this, but get it done." So the lawyers came up with a brilliant solution. If Lasseter brings his train, has it hauled down to Disneyland, and the only people allowed to ride on it are just employed by John Lasseter personally, his personal employees. So the hierarchy of Disney, like the cream of the board of directors, the leadership of the company, people like Marty Sklar and Tony Baxter and Tom Staggs, who's now chairman of all the parks around the world, and of course Bob Iger, who's now chair. All these folks agree to become employees of John Lasseter for one day, so they could put this train on the track, and then Ollie and Ward Kimball's family were all invited to come to this event. Pre-opening, 7 in the morning at Disneyland. So our society, we were going to be the ruse, if you will, to get Ollie to come to the park. He was going to accept a special citation in honor of the 50th anniversary of Disneyland. So we made up this beautiful certificate, framed it, so on. So I'm there to present this certificate, and we had a number of our board of governors there, and so we're there in the train station at New Orleans Square, Frontierland, and at a queue, when I read this citation, somebody radioed to the engineer in the locomotive to start through the tunnel and pull into the station in Frontierland. And so, tooting the steam whistle and so on, he pulled into the station, bells ringing, and Ollie looks around and he realizes that sounds very familiar. And he looks around and it's his engine that he hadn't seen in about 8 years.
Wow.
And he called it the Marie E. after his wife, who was not there that day. She was ailing from cancer and actually passed not long after that. So it was a very emotional experience for everybody to see this reunion of Ollie and his engine. Of course, John Lasseter is just proud as punch to be responsible for all this. So he tells Ollie, but you can run your engine around the park. So his two sons are helping him get into the cab, because Ollie had gotten quite advanced by then in age. And so then his son starts to give Ollie some instructions on how to pull the throttle out, and Ollie puts up his hand. He said, "I know what to do. This is my engine." So basically waves off his supportive sons and said, "Leave me alone. I know what to do."
Right.
So then everybody loads on who were, quote, employees of John Lasseter, all the executives. They all board the train with Ollie's family and so on. Everybody on board, and Ollie in the cab, and they run around the park, a couple of loops around Disneyland. And to this day, it was one of my great memories to be there, to witness that, and to witness what can happen if you really want something bad enough. And I remember talking to a young lady there who was in the legal department at the studio, who was responsible for writing the agreement, coming up with a solution. And she says, "You have no idea what we've gone through to get this to happen. But and Mr. Eisner wants something, he'd make it happen." Kind of remembering, Walt's direction. If the boss wants it, you figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And John Lasseter even had these beautiful monogrammed shirts with a beautiful embroidery commemorating that day. And talk about a collectible. I mean, they were only given to the people that were there. And it's got a full back with a design of the engine and the dates and so on. And it was just a great, great day. And we got all that handled, had a nice breakfast reception there in New Orleans Square, and we all got out of there before the park opened to the public. So that was really a very, very special day. And I think indicative of the power of railroading and Disney and its history that's still continuing on to this day.
Yeah, I think you summed that up really nicely. That there are, dare I call them beautiful, but there are a lot of beautiful threads of railroading that run through the Disney story, and it's amazing that you see something that Walt was so passionate about that has continued generation after generation. Even decades down the road, these ties of railroading are still, the fingerprints are all over the Disney story. You just have to look for them.
Right, and Sharon and I, she and I co-founded the Carrollwood Pacific Historical Society over 20 years ago, basically to preserve all this and to promote the remembrance of Walt's legacy, and then through books that we've written and the national tours we've done across the country. In fact, we're going to do another tour this coming year. We'll start in Hampton, Virginia, on January 10th and 11th. We'll be at the Hampton Roads Convention Center with the World's Greatest Hobby on Tour show. It will be in 4 cities, actually a 5th one, which is not part of the tour, but we'll be at the Tournament Players Center in Jacksonville, Florida. And that's in February. But we'll be in Raleigh, North Carolina, Columbus, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, and Jacksonville, Florida. And we recently acquired a RV, a 5th wheel, and a pickup truck, 4-wheel drive pickup, that we'll be hauling from Prescott Lakes, Arizona, where we live, across country. And we'll be making a few stops along the way, like New Orleans and San Antonio and so on. It's about a 7,000-mile odyssey. But we used to fly to these cities for these tours when we started back in 2004 in Edison, New Jersey, and we used to do 4 to 5 cities around the country, in all parts of the country. And I can remember, boarding aircraft, flying out, getting there on a Friday, leaving Sunday night, get back to our location in Southern California at the time, and it was very arduous. So we decided, this time, we hadn't been on the tour for about 3 years. We're going to go back on tour. We're taking our dog with us, and we're just going to take our time and see what I call flyover country, and do it on the ground and take our time and just have a wonderful experience. And hopefully along the way see our members who are invited to come to these shows for free. And if anybody's interested, it's all on our Carrollwood Chronicle, which is our publication come out about 4 or 5 times a year, and they're all on our website, which is carolwood.com. And if anyone's interested in what we do, that's our website.
Very good. And for anybody who would also like to purchase a copy of your book, which is Walt Disney's Railroad Story, which goes into so much more depth than anything we could cover in the time we have today, can they get the book on that website as well, or where's the best place to pick up the book?
There's a couple of stores that carry it, museum stores such as the California State Railroad Museum and so on. But yes, we do have it. We have a store on our website. It's one of the tabs in the home page. So the store will take you to the books and other memorabilia and pins and hats and all that necessary stuff. If you're in a hobby or have an interest, you always have to have stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, the book, in fact, the 4th edition just came out. We just got it from our publisher, who happens to be Waldsworth Donning out of Marceline, Missouri. Very
interesting. Very interesting.
So, yeah, it's available there, and if people on the order form, if they want to personalize or, and I sign them and so on, we're happy to do that for anyone. And it's a great gift, for people that are hard to buy for, a book about Walton railroading. It always is a nice gift for somebody.
And it truly is an incredible story. And like I said, when you see the detail that Michael has gone into with this book, it is absolutely incredible. We're going to run out of time here in a second. You've been listening to Michael Broggie, author of Walt Disney's Railroad Story, the man who Walt Disney gave his H.O. Railroad to, and a man who took some safety risk as a child to ride on Walt Disney's Backyard Railroad. Michael, hey, thank you so much for your time. We hope you'll come back and share some more with us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Well, there you have it, the Walt Disney Railroad Story, right from Michael Broggie, who lived part of it. A great interview. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did conducting it. A couple of notes before we get out of here. Number one is the Notch 6 email list. You can find the sign up for this email list on the left side of the Notch 6 website, which is www.notch6, N-O-T-C-H, and the number 6.com. We use that email list to send out special announcements about products from Madison Poster and also about the Madison Hardware Shirt Project. We also use that email list to communicate directly with you guys about input that we want. We let you know about upcoming show topics, etc. So to join that email list, hop on over to the Notch 6 website, sign up on the left side of the page. That's one of the best ways that you're going to get early inside information about what's going on with the show. We'll use that to announce the survey later this year and announce upcoming features, etc. For smaller news items in between, we do like to use our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/notch6. That's N-O-T-C-H and the number 6. And so we'll continue to use the Facebook page for smaller programming notes, release times, etc. You can also find that information I normally posted up on the O-Gauge Railroading online forum. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of Notch 6. Be sure, if you listen to us on iTunes, to leave a review. Same thing goes with Stitcher or any other way that you pick up the show. If you like the show, leave a review. It helps us out quite a bit. That'll do it for this time. We'll see you Thanksgiving evening for the Notch 6 Holiday Guide, and we'll be back in December with the second annual Notch 6 Christmas Spectacular. Until then, I'm Derek Thomas, and keep it in Notch 6.
Thanks for listening to Notch 6, the only podcast dedicated to O-Gauge trains. You can find every episode on our website, notch6.com, or on iTunes and Stitcher. We'll see you again soon. Until then, be sure to keep it in Notch 6. The following has been a production of Notch 6 Media and is intended for private use only. This show may not be copied or redistributed without express written consent. This show copyright 2014, all rights reserved.